a never-ending effort to keep the tremendous presses and hungry machines supplied with the raw material for bodies and cars and trucks for Americans and for the world.
Back in the golden age of American horsepower, when Detroit engineers worked overtime, drag strips were packed on Saturday nights, and every car company was locked in a flat-out war to see who could build the meanest machine. Most people know the legends: the Hemi Cuda, the Chevelle SS 454, the Boss 429 Mustang. But what if I told you Ford built something before all of those? A car that could embarrass every single one of them on the quarter mile, and almost nobody remembers it. Only 100 were ever built, ever, and today, when one comes up for auction, collectors go absolutely crazy. We're talking over $200,000 for a car most people at your local car show have never even heard of. This is the story of the 1964 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt, the fastest, wildest, most forgotten weapon Ford ever unleashed on the drag strip. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to wonder how this car ever slipped through the cracks of automotive history. The Fairlane's forgotten origins. To understand why the Thunderbolt is such a big deal, you have to go back to 1955. That's when Ford first introduced the Fairlane, a name that came from Henry Ford's estate, Fairlane, in Dearborn, Michigan. Back then, it was a chrome-drenched two-tone cruiser, inline sixes, and a Y-block V8 under the hood. Think jukebox on wheels. Think Americana. Honestly, if you squint just right, you can spot a car just like it cruising around Courthouse Square in Back to the Future. For most of the late 1950s and into the early 60s, the Fairlane was exactly what middle-class American families wanted: comfortable, reliable, the kind of car you drove to church on Sunday morning. But then something happened in Detroit, something that would change everything. In 1964, Pontiac quietly dropped a 389 cubic inch V8 into the Tempest Le Mans and called it the GTO. The muscle car era had officially begun. Suddenly, the rules changed. Horsepower wasn't just bragging rights anymore. It was the only thing that mattered. And what happened on the drag strip on the weekend drove what people bought at the dealership on Monday morning. The Fairlane had received the Challenger 289 in 1963, with solid lifters pushing it to 271 horsepower. That was decent for the time, but against the GTO, against what was coming from Chrysler with the 426 Hemi, it was bringing a pocket knife to a gunfight. Ford needed a weapon, and one man in Rhode Island had an idea. The birth of the Thunderbolt. Here's where things get interesting, and it all starts with a Ford dealer named Bob Tasca. Bob Tasca ran a dealership in Bristol, Rhode Island, and the man was obsessed with performance. He took it upon himself to do what Ford hadn't done yet. He shoehorned a 427 cubic inch FE engine into a standard Fairlane 500 road car. The result was so impressive, so violent, so utterly insane for what looked like a plain Jane family sedan, that it caught the attention of Frank Zimmerman, Ford's marketing manager at the time. Zimmerman saw exactly what Tasca had built: a sleeper, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a car that would annihilate the competition at every NHRA event across the country, while wearing the most innocuous body Ford sold. And in drag racing, credibility on the track meant sales on the showroom floor. Ford gave the green light. The Fairlane Thunderbolt was born. Now, why the Fairlane instead of the bigger Galaxy? Ford had been winning with the Galaxy on road courses and oval tracks, but the Thunderbolt was built for the straight line. The Fairlane was a full foot shorter in overall length, had a 3.5-inch shorter wheelbase, and was meaningfully lighter. Less car to push meant more speed at the line. Simple math. But here's the engineering challenge. The Fairlane's engine bay was designed for nothing bigger than a Ford small block. Getting a 427 FE big block in there wasn't just ambitious, it was borderline impossible. Ford engineers had to relocate suspension components just to make room. When they were done, they dropped in the high-riser 427, an engine with a 12-to-1 compression ratio, dual 4-barrel carburetors, long tube headers, and a ram air induction system that sucked cold air straight through ducts where the inner headlights used to be. That's right, they replaced the headlights with air intakes. If that doesn't tell you how serious Ford was, nothing will. The engine needed room to breathe under the hood, too, which is why the Thunderbolt got that distinctive teardrop dome on the hood. It wasn't a styling flourish, it was pure function. The weight-stripping war machine. Now let's talk about what Ford did to the rest of the car, because the engine was only half the story. If you've ever bought a new car and the dealer tries to add all those option packages, all that extra stuff, you know how Detroit loves to load cars up. Ford did the exact opposite with the Thunderbolt. They stripped it down to the bones. Out went the sound-deadening material, gone. The radio, removed. Carpeting, stripped. The heater, they pulled that too. Spare tire, you won't need it at the drag strip. Anything that had weight and wasn't bolted down for safety was eliminated. Then they went further. The front doors, fenders, and hood were replaced with lightweight fiberglass pieces. The side windows, replaced with thin plexiglass. Every gram counted. Even the seats were specially selected. Buyers had two choices: lightweight chairs pulled straight from Ford's police package vehicles, or bucket seats salvaged from the Econoline van. Not exactly luxury, but you weren't buying this car for luxury. For better weight distribution on the strip, the battery was relocated to the trunk. That might seem like a small detail, but when you're chasing fractions of a second on the quarter mile, balance matters. The result? A car that was mean, stripped, purposeful, and utterly uncompromising. This wasn't a muscle car you'd cruise to the drive-in. This was a race car with license plates. And the transmission? You had two choices. A 4-speed manual with a 4.57 rear end for the purists who like to row their own gears, or a 3-speed MX Cruise-O-Matic automatic with a 4.44 ratio, which, according to records, 59 of the 100 cars were equipped with. The numbers that made jaws drop. All right, let's talk numbers, because the specs on the Thunderbolt are where things get truly wild. Officially, Ford rated the Thunderbolt at 425 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque from that 427 cubic inch V8. And even at face value, those numbers were absolutely ferocious for 1964. But here's the dirty little secret that every serious Thunderbolt historian will tell you. 425 horsepower was a conservative, politically motivated number. According to sources like Classic.com, the real output from that high-riser 427 was likely closer to 500 horsepower, and some estimates push it to 600. Ford underrated it intentionally to stay below the threshold that would have triggered additional scrutiny from racing sanctioning bodies. Sound familiar? Detroit did this all the time in the muscle car era. Chrysler did it with the 426 Hemi. Ford did it with the Boss 429. Everybody played the game. Specs: Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt. Engine: 427 cubic inches. High-riser FEV8. Official power: 425 horsepower, likely 500 to 600 actual. Torque: 480 pound-feet. Compression: 12-to-1. Induction: dual 4-barrel carbs plus ram air. Quarter mile: 11.61 seconds. Transmission: 4-speed manual or 3-speed automatic. Total built: 100 units, 1964 only. That quarter-mile time, 11.61 seconds, was absolutely otherworldly in 1964. A new Corvette ran the quarter mile in around 14 seconds that year. The GTO that started the whole muscle car craze. Mid-14s to low 15s, the Thunderbolt was in a completely different universe. Ford campaigned the Thunderbolt heavily in NHRA stock eliminator events. Drivers like Gas Ronda helped put the Thunderbolt on the map. These weren't hobby runs. These were full national championship-level performances. Thunderbolt versus Boss. 429. Ford versus Ford. Now, I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, wait, what about the Boss 429? Isn't that the ultimate Ford muscle car? And look, I love the Boss 429. It's one of the most iconic Mustangs ever built. Ford literally had to redesign the entire Mustang engine bay to squeeze that NASCAR-developed 7.0-liter V8 in there. With just 1,359 units ever sold, it's one of the rarest Mustangs in history. Ford officially rated the Boss 429 at 375 horsepower, though many credible sources agree the real number was closer to 500. The Boss ran the quarter mile in around 13.7 seconds in period testing. Now let's compare. Head-to-head. Thunderbolt Boss 429. Year: 1964-1969. Engine: 427 cubic inches. V8: 429 cubic inches. V8. Official horsepower: 425 horsepower. 375 horsepower. Torque: 480 pound-feet. 410 pound-feet. Quarter mile: 11.61 seconds, approximately 13.7 seconds. Units built: 101,359. 5 years earlier, the Thunderbolt was running the quarter mile more than 2 seconds faster, with more torque from an engine built for the sole purpose of dominating the drag strip. The Thunderbolt was also 13 times rarer, 100 cars. That's it. The entire production run would fit in a modest parking lot. And here's where it gets really interesting. Most muscle car fans today will tell you all about the Boss 429 without hesitation. Ask them about the Thunderbolt, and you'll often get a blank stare. That's the power of marketing. And that's exactly why stories like this need to be told. Why did the world forget? So if the Thunderbolt was this fast, this special, this unbelievable, why did the world forget about it? A few reasons. First, Ford only built 100 of them. They weren't sold through normal dealer channels to the general public. They were purpose-built for drag racing. You didn't walk into your local Ford showroom and buy a Thunderbolt. If you wanted one, you had to know the right people. Second, the car looked ordinary. That was the whole point, a sleeper. But it worked against its legacy. While the Mustang was on the cover of every car magazine in America with its long hood and short deck, the Thunderbolt looked like it came from the fleet lot. Journalists weren't writing love letters about its styling. That kept it out of the pop culture spotlight. Third, Ford quickly moved on. The muscle car wars escalated rapidly through the mid to late 60s, and Ford had the Mustang to sell. The Boss 302, the Boss 429, the Shelby GT 500. There was always a new headline grabber. The Thunderbolt's moment was 1964, and then the world moved on. But the 100 people who owned them? They knew. The drag racers who lined up against them? They knew. And today, a new generation of collectors is rediscovering this incredible machine. What it's worth today. And this is where collectors started paying serious attention. According to Haggerty, a Fairlane Thunderbolt in good condition will cost you around $201,000 today. The highest recorded sale sits at $286,000. These are consistent, repeating valuations for one of the rarest and most significant drag racing cars Ford ever built. In 2022, a documented original example, car number 17 of the 100 built, one of 59 equipped with the 3-speed automatic, crossed the block at Bring a Trailer. The hammer dropped at $210,000, though the reserve wasn't actually met that time. Think about that. $210,000, and the seller still said no. Now, if you want to get into Thunderbolt ownership without a $250,000 investment, there is a back door. You can find Fairlanes retrofitted with a 427 engine. One project car in rough shape sold for $26,250 in 2022. But let me be crystal clear. There is no substitute for a genuine, documented, numbers-matching Thunderbolt. With only 100 built, provenance is everything. The car's paperwork, build sheet, and documented history add or subtract tens of thousands of dollars from the value. And with each passing year, as these cars become better understood and their rarity better appreciated, the trajectory only goes one direction: up. The 1964 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt. 100 cars, built to win, built to scare everything else on the strip, and somehow, some way, nearly forgotten by history. Until now. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Did you know the Thunderbolt existed before this video? And if you could have any forgotten American muscle car sitting in your garage right now, what would it be? If this video brought back some memories, or if you learned something new today, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your favorite forgotten muscle car in the comments. We read every single one. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, the most interesting cars in history aren't always the ones on the posters.